Yeah. I got him. That's my bad. But the jurors were supposed to tell me. They tried to get my attention, but I was talking to you guys. Go ahead. Go get him. Yeah, I'm going to.
Judge, I think they need to just take his handcuffs off.
Say it again?
His handcuffs are on, so.
How are we doing time-wise?
Just, you know, the state has asked me to speed it up because their expert needs to get out of town, and they've indicated I can have a little more leeway in letting Dr. Eisenstein be more narrative if you allow it, Your Honor, so I'm trying to speed it up.
That's fine, so long the speeding up doesn't mean talk fast, though. Speeding up meaning just get to the point.
That's what we're all trying to do.
Well, I understand, but, you know, we spent 40 minutes this morning on Dr. Wu's CV, and I know it's impressive, but it's, you know, we've got to get to where the rubber meets the road here. I'm not telling you how to do your job. You're trying to keep the jurors interested in the case.
Yeah, yes, sir.
My goal is to be finished tomorrow. That is my goal.
We will be finished tomorrow.
That should be your goal, too. You have an appointment on Thursday.
Yes, sir, I do.
Jerry. Yeah, good. Jury's present and seated. You may proceed.
Dr. Wu, without going into a real wordy, detailed description, can you just itemize the names of the tests that you administered and in one or two words what each one was designed to do?
I think you mean Eisenstein.
I'm sorry, Dr. Eisenstein. What did I say?
I take it as a compliment.
Oh, Dr. Wu. Okay. Okay, we're not going to be as long as with Dr. Wu. I'm really trying, folks.
They look identical.
Yes. Dr. Eisenstein. Anyway, please recite just briefly the tests that you administered.
So, not necessarily in this order, but this is alphabetical order, but not necessarily in the order that they were given. Advanced Clinical Solutions Word Choice, Test of Premorbid Functioning, the Boston Naming Test, Category Test, the Dallas-Kaplan Executive Function System Trailmaking Test, and Verbal Fluency Test, Expressive Vocabulary Test, 2nd edition, Hooper Visual Organization Test, Incomplete Sentences, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, 2nd edition, Paragraph Writing, Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test, 4th edition, Projective Drawings, the Ray Ostrich Complex Figure Copy, Immediate and Delayed Recall, the Rough 2 and 7 Selective Attention Test, Stroop Color and Word Test, Structured Interview of Malingered Symptomatology, Tactile Performance Test, Test of Memory Malingering, Trailmaking Test Part A and B, the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale 4th edition, Wechsler Memory Scale 4th edition, Wide Range Achievement Test 4th edition, and the Wisconsin Card Sorting Test.
And thank you. And would you please state in your own words what conclusions you reached, what facts support them, proceed.
As I mentioned earlier, before completing testing that has any validity, one has to complete what's called malingering test to see whether or not the individual is faking, they're lying, they're dishonest. And as I mentioned, I gave multiple malingering tests, standard tests that are accepted in the neuropsychological community, and he passed every single test. Every test was done perfectly, near perfect, which means that there was no indication that he's faking, he's malingering, he's lying. Because if that's the case, I would have to stop right now and really couldn't tell you anything else about him, because he's trying to look worse than he is. And as I've indicated before, Mr. Hayes wants to look as best as he can, the exact opposite. So he wants to perform at his optimal level, his best performance. That's the reason why it was really easy to evaluate him the whole time. He wasn't trying to fool me, as it is many cases, because there could be some secondary gains as to why someone wants to look worse than they are. They don't want to look impaired. They don't want to look at their brain damage. So that's not the case with Mr. Hayes. His full-scale IQ score is 112, which puts him in the high average range. There were splits between verbal and performance, which is, it should be always more or less the same. And here there was an 8-point split between verbal and performance. The split becomes even more noticed when it came the Wechsler memory scale, where auditory or verbal memory was 109 average, but visual memory was 136, very superior. There was a 27-point split, almost 2 standard deviations, meaning that there's something going on in his brain that shows some areas are functioning at one level and others are functioning much higher. And when you have a discordance or some tests that are scores that are not congruent, that's an indication that something is going on in terms of what I refer to as cognitive dysregulation. Something is not normal. Probably the most significant finding is in terms of executive functioning. Executive functioning is frontal lobe, right here, the front part of the brain. That is the decision-making, the ability to abstract, the ability to control impulses. It's the most intricate computer part of the brain. And that's on the Wisconsin card sorting test. He was 2.5 standard deviations below the mean, which means that he's going from mild to moderate, moderate to severe. In other words, his performance was moderate to severe. The greatest problem was what is referred to as perseveration errors. Perseveration errors means that he is unable to profit from feedback telling him he's wrong on doing this test, and then to correct his behavior, his responses, and saying, well, what is the correct response? He goes back to an old learned behavior that's incorrect. He's told that's wrong, and yet he continues with that's doing the incorrect behavior, the incorrect response, and this is one of the indicators of frontal lobe executive functioning impairment. Again, the discrepancy between some very high scores and between this and the very low scores, we're talking about 2 ends of the continuum in terms of where he falls. So those noted discrepancies is a red flag that something is going on. Also on trail making tests, particularly on trail making part B, 98 seconds and 2 errors. Given his IQ, given his ability, this score is in the moderately impaired range. He should have no difficulty doing this whatsoever, and yet it took longer than the expected norm, and he also committed 2 errors. There was a whole history of head injuries. Briefly, I'm going to describe them. He had fights in school, hitting his head. He was kicked in the head, lost consciousness when he was 13 years old, taken to the hospital. He played tackle football, and he played both tight end and also on the defense. You get lots of knocks, and there's a whole phenomenon about certainly football players that have knocks to the head in terms of the consequences in terms of cognitive dementia. He also, when he was a teenager, he stole a pair of Nike shoes. You know, he wanted to look like, you know, all the other kids, and he jumped into the canal near his house. Mr. Hayes could not swim. He's there with, you know, the police are chasing him while he's in the canal, and he's under the water to 1 to 2 minutes, and he can't swim. He probably suffered some anoxia, loss of oxygen to the brain from being under the water. So that's another event. He also, he had 2 spinal taps when he was found. He had a potassium deficiency, 2004. He left the hospital against medical advice. Again, there's something going on neurologically with him, and you know, these events are just, again, cumulative. 2009, he had a motorcycle accident. He was thrown from the bike. His right shoulder was injured. Medical records indicate that there was some brain scan. It was unclear. Certainly, whenever you do a brain scan, there's suspicion of brain damage. The fact that you're tossed from a motorcycle and you injure your shoulder, the head is certainly close enough, proximate to the shoulder, that probably he sustained some injury. Again, Mr. Hayes minimizes all damages. He wants to look better than he really is, and he doesn't. He has a hard time admitting that there's something went wrong. Then there was also an event, 2013. He went to the hospital for swelling of the head. So, again, what's the ramifications of all these head injuries? Again, they're shearing to the brain. There's chemical changes. There's loss of oxygen. There's bleeding in the brain, loss of neurons, all these different events. Again, synergistic and cumulative in nature. It's not there's one can point and say, this is the single event that caused all this. It's accumulation of multiple different events with lack of maybe documentation, but certainly the events are significant, and certainly they all add up to paint a picture. Again, the brain injury explains or certainly can contribute to the fact that he had difficulty in interpersonal relationships, employment, family relationships, education. Everything that he did, it was halted. He did things and then he stopped. He did things and he stopped. To his credit, he always continued to doing them, but 40 jobs, multiple relationships. He never was really satisfied. He continued to persevere, but there was always something that went on that didn't explain. There was some halting of his behavior. He played multiple instruments, talented young man, but continued to move on from one thing to the other. There's a certain amount of unrest in his behavior. He tried very hard, but yet something is pulling that prevented him from really just kind of settling down. And that's what, again, the perseveration is the inability to profit from the background, and again is associated with frontal lobe. If I can just give a very quick illustration of what this all means. So if this is considered the spinal cord of the person, and this is the limbic system, and then this is the prefrontal frontal lobe. So again, one has to understand, as certainly as Dr. Wu showed in many illustrations, that there has to be a flow from the spinal cord, where there was some damage, to this part, the amygdala, and the hippocampus that controls basic instincts, basic functioning, and then it has to give signals to this part here, which is the frontal lobe. And the frontal lobe, again, receives all of this. It all has to be a real clear flow, and there was a disruption of that flow, and that disruption of the flow certainly could explain a lot of this behavior that was across the board. Again, the most significant findings, just to recap, were in personal relationships, poor planning, inability to be flexible. Again, he was reactive, not active in terms of his thinking. And I guess just the final point that I want to make is the fact that the major problem in terms of the background, in terms of the dysfunctional family, the sexual abuse, the violence and the abuse, and growing up in such an environment, he never really learned appropriate sexual behavior. And the aggression that followed from the sexual acts, again, was very, very similar in terms of inability to control the impulses, specifically in these areas. And that's where it manifested, unfortunately, the breakdown. Other areas of his life, as I described, he tried very, very hard, and he really wanted to maintain to being an outstanding individual. These areas, unfortunately, didn't have control. It's in my clinical opinion that he's not even aware of what happened because it's so atypical from what he wanted to present. That's not the type of person that he really wants to present. But if you're not aware of what you're doing, and certainly without planning for any of these events, as mentioned, the fact that, if you're going to commit a horrific act, you certainly would use a condom to certainly not only, in terms of considering about any witness to the crime, but you're your own worst enemy, so to speak, by the fact that his own DNA is going to be implanted in the victims. And if you'd planned this in terms of the totality, you would certainly think about this ahead, which obviously he did not. So it's very impulsive. It's not thought out. It's very much in terms of consistent with frontal lobe damage, and specifically with all the other factors in terms of the developmental issues about the abnormal development in terms of the stress, the sexual behavior, the family that really, unfortunately, really never put it all together in terms of a healthy, normal development. And in spite of that, he tried very, very hard. He really did. Unfortunately, in this area, it was obviously with very dire consequences.
Yes, sir. And you mentioned the condom issue the same way, which Dr. Wu also brought up. And am I correct in understanding that the reason you're bringing it up is that failing to use a condom is inconsistent with this being a cold, calculated, premeditated act? In other words, the actual killing.
That's correct.
Okay. Let me ask you another question. Why did you recommend a brain scan with neurocognitive imaging?
After I conducted the neuropsych exam and came to the conclusions that I did, so neuropsychological evaluation deals with functional behavior, scores, behavior from plotting his scores relative to other people in the general population. That's how the test is. It's considered a behavior, a function. But in terms of the underlying brain pathology, in other words, what the brain actually looks like, so to further corroborate these findings in terms of the fact that there is some brain impairment, I recommended that we do neurodiagnostic testing in order to further evaluate that not only is there brain pathology in terms of functioning, but there's brain pathology actually in terms of how actually the brain looks like, what the brain is capable or not capable of doing, and the various different functions of the brain and where the brain is abnormal.
Dr. Eisenstein, is there anything else that I failed to ask you about that you believe will help the jury better understand what went on?
No.
Okay. If I may have a moment.
Yes, sir.
We'll tender the witness to the state, Your Honor.
All right, thank you. State cross-examination.
I just have a few questions for you this afternoon, Doctor. How are you doing today?
Thank you. Good afternoon. And yourself?
I'm doing pretty well, thank you for asking.
Go ahead.
Doctor, I want to talk first about just the general IQ score of Mr. Hayes. The full scale IQ score, what was that number again?
112.
And you said on direct examination that put him in the high average?
That's correct.
And what percentile rank would that put him in?
79.
And does that essentially mean if there were 100 people in the room, he'd finish ahead of 78 of them?
That's
Or
correct.
less? Okay. Going to the executive functioning testing, which I think is on page 9 of your report, right?
Correct.
And you discussed a couple of these tests specifically on direct examination, but were all of these tests, or are all of these tests designed to determine someone's level of executive function?
There's a component of each one. That is correct.
Okay. I want to go through all of them really quickly with you. First, the Tactual performance test, that first one. What was his verbal score that you gave him on the Tactual performance test?
It doesn't go by a verbal score.
Well, I'm seeing that there was, I'll strike the question. Describe what that test is for the jury.
The individual's blindfolded, and they're asked to place various different shapes on a form board using their right hand, their dominant hand, their left hand, and then both hands.
And it's about the amount of time that they can finish that test in.
That's correct.
But you do give a verbal score in this paragraph in your report, don't you, for after that you complete it in 5 minutes and 37 seconds, and you say high average range.
Oh, that's what you mean. Well,
Yes.
I'm sorry. Yeah, that's when one uses high average in this it's a descriptor.
Okay.
So it's not necessarily verbal, but yeah, I understand what you're saying. Yes.
Let's call it a verbal descriptor. How
Okay, that's fine.
We'll meet halfway.
Not a problem.
All right, so verbal descriptor, the high average range for the Tactual performance test.
That's correct.
Okay. And then you had the next paragraph down, there was a shape test that he was asked to draw the various shapes and place them in their correct locations. You remember it's 7 out of 10 shapes, right?
Correct.
And what was your verbal description for that?
It was mildly impaired.
It was mildly impaired?
That's correct.
And then the next part of that paragraph, where you had to localize 6 of the shapes. What was your verbal description there?
Average.
Average. And on the category test, what was your verbal description there of how he performed?
That was normal.
And the Wisconsin card sorting test you testified a little bit about on direct, and you said on direct that was moderately impaired function.
Correct.
And can you describe that test for the jury?
The individual they have a stack of 64 cards and then an additional 64 cards. In place in front of them are 4 different shapes. One's a triangle, one's a cross, and so on and so forth. There's 4 different shapes. And the one is color. What the individual has to do is they have to match by different order of what the test requires. So they first have to start out by matching the individual card to color. It doesn't make a difference to shape. And that's after getting 10 correct, then they have to move on to the next which is the shape. Shapes have to be put in the right order. If they get it correct, and after that, if they get it they get it incorrect, that's what's considered to be a perseverative error.
And there's really 2 parts where you're evaluating the person. It's how many categories they can complete and also the errors, right?
That's correct.
And how did he do on that first part in terms of the categories that he completed?
It was in the average range.
And on the errors, how you said that was the moderately impaired area, right?
That's correct.
And there were 19 errors?
Correct.
How many would the average person have?
Well, again, that's based on normative data. And again, it's his score versus the normative data divided by the standard deviation. So in other words, he's 2.5 standard deviations below the mean based on the number of errors that he committed.
So it's more in terms of his performance on the testing itself, or are you comparing him to the general population?
We're comparing him to the general population for his age category.
And what would the general population, what would be an average number of errors for somebody for the general population?
You want to know what's normal?
I do.
So normal would be 6.92 errors. The standard deviation is 5.04. So his score of 17 errors was 2.42 standard deviations below the mean.
All right, that makes sense to me. Thank you, sir. Now let's move on to the Dellis-Kaplan Executive Functioning System test. There were four subparts to this test, right?
Correct.
And on the first part, letter fluency, he was above average range.
Correct.
On the category fluency, that was low end average range.
Correct.
On the total correct switching, he was average.
Correct.
And finally, on the switching accuracy, he was high end of average.
Correct.
And then finally, the last test in the executive functioning was the Dellis-Kaplan trail making test, correct?
Correct.
And what verbal score, verbal rating did you give him there?
They're well in the average range.
The average range, okay. Now I want to talk to you very quickly about this head trauma that you testified to. On direct, you mentioned lack of documentation. Would you agree that there is actually a complete lack of documentation of Mr. Hayes having any history of head injuries? Objective documentation.
Correct.
So there were no records available from this hospitalization in 94 or 95 for him when he was in this fight.
Correct.
And there was no documentation from when he was admitted to the hospital allegedly for falling into the canal.
Correct.
No documentation for him going to Halifax and having I believe that was the spinal tap, so the potassium deficiency, correct?
Correct.
No documentation, some documentation for the Charlotte visit in 2009, including a Glasgow Coma scale was given in that case, right?
Correct.
What is the Glasgow Coma scale?
That's a scale. It's scored 15 is you are considered to be oriented. You're aware. You're responding. It's just very simple areas of brain functioning in terms of the individual that comes. Usually either the medics or in ER to see what level they arrive in terms of their just very basic functioning.
And in relation to that incident on October 1st of 2009, what was Mr. Hayes' Glasgow Coma scale?
It was 15.
So again, that's normal.
Correct.
And in that case, he was wearing a helmet when he crashed, wasn't he?
That's what he said. Correct.
And then do you have any documentation from, there are two incidents you brought up that I couldn't see in your report, the 2013 swelling of the head.
Correct. There's no documentation.
And of course, the football injuries, there's no documentation. Again, objective data or material showing that he suffered any type of head injury from playing football.
Correct.
So really, your testimony about history of head injuries is based primarily upon information given to you by Mr. Hayes and his family.
Correct.
And then, Doctor, just a couple other questions. You're familiar with the DSM-5, right?
Yes, I am.
You didn't diagnose Mr. Hayes with any mental disorders from the DSM-5, did you?
That's correct.
Including him being autistic.
Correct.
And finally, Doctor, you mentioned that you were getting paid $300 an hour, right?
Correct.
And back when your deposition was taken by the state on January 13th of 2022, you indicated that you had billed about $45,000. How many more hours have you worked since that time, if you had to estimate?
I would say probably another 30, maybe, give or take.
So that's about another $9,000.
Yeah, give or take.
Okay. I have one moment, Your Honor.
Yes.
Thank you, Doctor. That's all I have for you. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you. Any redirect?
Dr. Eisenstein, for how many years have you been practicing neuropsychology? Did you say 40 years around there?
40 years.
Okay. And early on in your career, when you used to review medical records and employment records and things like that, you could find records that were 20, 30 years old, couldn't you?
That's correct.
And then something changed recently, didn't it?
That's correct.
And now there's been legislation passed and people can just, hospitals, schools can shred records after 10 or so years, right?
That's correct.
Okay. And is it fair to assume that that could explain why you don't have records of some of these head traumas, that they're beyond the shredding age?
That's very possible.
Okay, anything else?
No, Your Honor.
All right, thank you. You may step down. Next witness. Defense? You may step down. Thank you.
The defense rests its face presentation.
State, you have anything you wish to present?
Yes, Judge. A statement called Dr. Negan. I think he's on Zoom.
Okay, let's give the expert time to come on.
Yes, sir. Of course.
Thank you.
Okay.
Only presenting about witnesses. I'm gonna have my witnesses sit on standby, and I may, if something strange happens, I may ask for a screw button.
Okay, I'll consider it, but I don't often grant it. Okay, Dr. Negan, can you hear me?
I can. Can you hear me okay?
We can. If you'll please raise your right hand and be sworn, please.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you shall give in this cause will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth to help you God?
I do.
And Bill, if you can slide the screen down just for the benefit of some of the viewers so they can see.
Yeah, for some reason I took up the whole screen though.
Oh,
Are you talking to me?
you got to eliminate the pin.
No, sir.
Is
Oh,
it
no.
remove pin
Okay.
on the one that's showing Mr. Lewis's face? Yes, I know. We're all happy about that. Thank God. Okay. All right, you may proceed.
Thank you, Judge. Good afternoon, Doctor. How you doing?
Good. Good afternoon. Thank you. I'm doing okay.
Good. Could you please introduce yourself to the jury? Can you spell your last name, sir?
Of course, my name is Jeffrey with a G, Geoffrey. Middle initials A like Apple, Negan, Negin, and I'm a medical doctor.
What do you do as a medical doctor? What's your specialty, sir?
I'm a diagnostic radiologist, and I'm also a neuroradiologist, which is a subspecialty within radiology.
If you could just briefly tell us a little bit about your background to become a neuroradiologist and radiologist, if you could, sir.
Of course. I went to college, undergraduate at Brandeis University in Massachusetts from 1981 to 1985 for 4 years and got my bachelor's degree. I went to medical school at the University of Miami School of Medicine in Miami, Florida, and got my MD from 1985 to 1989. Then I did my residency, which is my training in radiology for 4 years. I did that from 1989 to 1993 at the University of South Florida College of Medicine in Tampa, Florida. Then I did something not all doctors or radiologists do. It's called a fellowship. That's additional subspecialty training within my field of expertise. So I did additional training in neuroradiology, which is the study of the brain and the spine. I did that from 1993 to 1994, also at the University of South Florida College of Medicine in Tampa. I'm board certified by the American Board of Radiology as a diagnostic radiologist, and I am board certified by the American Board of Radiology as a neuroradiologist. And I have been for about 28 years, and I am actively certified in both, and I have to take a test every week in neuroradiology to maintain that certification. So that's a big part of what I do, and I practice neuroradiology every day in my current practice.
And if you could just tell the jury, are you a practicing physician where you, on a consistent daily basis and weekly basis, review different sorts of scans, including MRIs, CAT scans, PET scans?
Yes, I'm one of the managing partners of a 23-person radiology group called Florida Radiology Consultants, I've been in this practice for 28 years, and we provide 24-hour service to the Lee Health System in Fort Myers, Florida. I work at a level 2 trauma center, Lee Memorial Hospital. I read MRIs, CAT scans of trauma patients every 10 minutes, 24 hours a day. I worked all night last night. I may look a little tired. I'll be working again as soon as we click off this Zoom. I'll be working tonight from 4 p.m. to midnight. I also cover many other hospitals and outpatient centers. And as a neuroradiologist, I read MRIs, CAT scans on trauma patients and all kinds of patients in the inpatient setting and outpatient setting all day and all night long.
And have you, in the course of your career, been asked to consult with defense attorneys before and testifying on the behalf of defendants?
Yes, I both defense and plaintiffs. I've testified on a frequent basis for both, yes.
So likewise, you testified for the prosecution before too?
Absolutely.
But in your practice, would you agree maybe it's 50-50 for the defense and for the state?
You're talking about these types of cases?
Yes, sir, that's correct.
No, it's probably about 2/3 of the time I've done it for the defense, or 3/4 of the time. I've done more defense work, but not because I choose to. Just whoever asks me, I'm happy to look at it. Many times my opinions are not helpful to the side that asks me to. I just tell you what I see. I'm not here. I have no skin in the game. I don't take side. I just say what the imaging shows. And if my opinions aren't helpful, I don't. Frequently, the side doesn't ask me to testify, of course. But probably 3/4 of the cases I've testified have been for the defense. I just testified last week for the defense in a similar matter like this. And but again, I don't pick and choose the side. It doesn't matter to me which side hires me. I just tell you what my opinions are and let you guys figure out what it all means.
Now, Doctor, how many times do you think you've been qualified as an expert to testify in interpreting scans in court before?
1,000?
And over the course of your career, how many PET scans, MRIs, and CAT scans have you reviewed?
Over 250,000.
So, would it be fair to say that you have a particular expertise in reviewing these sort of scans for a consistent basis?
Yes, absolutely. This is my expertise.
So, just so we can be clear for the jurors, when a hospital, when someone comes in from a car crash or a serious situation, and they have injuries to their brain or other parts of their body, are you the individual who is on call at certain times, and you would read those and provide information to the actual doctors on scene as what to do or what it's showing?
Yes, all imaging is interpreted by a radiologist. It doesn't have to be a neuroradiologist like myself. Not all my partners are neuroradiologists. Out of 25 radiologists, only 5 of us are actually neuroradiologists. I have greater expertise than many of my partners in this area, but that is correct. Radiologists are the ones who provide the interpretation of all imaging studies, and we give a written interpretation that's done instantly, transmitted electronically to the ordering doctor so they know what's wrong and how to treat the patient. That's correct.
So if it's a life decision, like doctors are there, trauma, they have to determine what to do about someone who may need emergency surgery to live. The scans that are taken, those are sent to you or one of your associates, and you guys read them and provide that information to the doctors?
That is correct. That's the role of the radiologist.
And I guess we talked circularly, so can you just tell us in basic what radiology is then?
Sure. It's the interpretation of imaging studies. X-rays, CAT scans, MRIs, ultrasound, mammograms, it goes on and on. I sit in front of a computer in the hospital or at my home, and I can access all the imaging done within the entire county of the Lee Health System that I work at, and I provide interpretations for all these studies, one after another, all day long, all night long.
And your subspecialty of neuroradiology, what does that really mean to a layperson like me?
That means I have specialized training and knowledge about the brain and the spine, the neck and the back, all those areas, because they involve the nerves. And I have extra training and expertise. I'm a member of the American Society of Neuroradiology. I'm a senior member, which is the highest level of recognition. I read their journals every month, so I spend my time studying it. I know all the literature, all the research, and the most difficult, interesting cases get sent to me to review within my practice. On a national level, I've been asked by many different organizations to evaluate traumatic brain injury. I work in the National Football League on a regular basis, evaluating the players who may or may not have chronic traumatic encephalopathy, which is a form of traumatic brain injury. I review cases on a national level of people who are in accidents and different types of things for traumatic brain injury. I also have done research with Alzheimer's disease, with the drug companies, seeing the effects of some of these new medicines that you may have heard of that have recently been released. I was involved in that research, determining whether or not these things have effects on the brain, things like that.
Yes, sir. So let's move along to the actual case of Mr. Hayes. Were you provided some scans of Mr. Hayes, and can you tell the jury which scans you were provided, sir?
I was. Give me one split second. I was provided 3 different things. I was provided an MRI, which is magnetic resonance imaging, which is the gold standard for evaluating the brain, by the way. And that was done on 2/24/22, very recently, as a matter of fact, just in the last week and a half. I was also provided a PET scan, which stands for positron emission tomography. And I'll explain what these tests are. And I was also, along with the MRI, something called the Neuroradiologist study, which is part of the MRI. I'll explain what all these things are as we go along. I know they're big words.
Right, and we're going to keep it super basic because we got to hear a lot earlier, and I think folks just want to hear in regular terms, like if you can tell us your evaluation of the MRI of Mr. Hayes and what your opinion is when reading that, what it shows.
Can you enable the screen share? Because I can't show anything. The screen share has been disabled.
Judge, may we have the screen share?
These are the kind of things you guys gotta give me a heads up.
I'm sorry, sir.
I have no idea. I mean, I can try to find it here. Actually,
It says the
over
host-
there, because that's the. Is it an option? Because sometimes they disable these options. Court administration does that.
Okay, I think you did it.
Thank you.
That was pretty slick. See that? Okay.
And
Can you see the image?
Yes, sir. Can you tell us what that
Good.
is?
It is. I will. This is a brain, and this is the brain of the person we're talking about. Mr. Robert Hayes. Date of birth is 3/12/1982. This exam is done, as I told you, on 2/24/22. Now, I'm not going to make you an expert at MRI exams, clearly. But what I want to show you is the most important features here. When we look at the brain, we want to look for scarring. That would be a sign of a previous injury, potentially. So I look on these images, and if there was a scar, it would be a white dot within this gray area. And I know you're not going to be able to interpret this, but the answer is, this person does not even have one tiny scar, not even 1 millimeter big. This is a perfect, couldn't be more normal. It's very unusual to not even have one little scar in your brain. Most of us get a little scarring as we age. Why is that? Just living. You bang your head. You may have hypertension, high blood pressure, diabetes, all different insults throughout life. You get progressive little scars in the brain. This person does not have a single scar. That's number one. The next thing I want to show you, give me just a moment. I did a lot of imaging. I did a very good quality study, a very thorough examination here. They did special images here. What these images do, they look for any hemosiderin. What is hemosiderin? That's a big word. That's a blood product. If this person ever had any bleeding in the brain for any reason, an injury, it would leave a stain. And there is no stain of hemosiderin. It would be a black dot. These are just blood vessels, the black you see. There's no abnormal staining in the brain. So this person never had bleeding in the brain from an injury or from any type of insult whatsoever. Okay? Next thing we look for, among others, again, obviously I'm not going to spend all day telling you all the hundreds of things we look at, but I'm trying to show you the most salient features that are important. Any kind of shrinkage of the brain. If you have a previous injury, the brain can shrink up. Just like because it doesn't work right. Just like if you injured your arm and you stop using your arm, the muscle shrinks up. Well, your brain is very similar. And there is no shrinkage of the brain anywhere. The brain is perfectly normal, no signs of any shrinkage or injury or anything like that. I can show you all kinds of cool pictures all day long, of course. This is the corpus callosum. But in summary, it's a perfectly normal brain. No sign of any injury of any kind at any point in this person's life. It can be detected They've never had any insults to the brain, no congenital abnormalities. Everything is perfectly normal. This is stone cold normal. There's nothing that can be said about it other than that.
Thank you, doctor. Can I ask you, okay, can we stop sharing
Yeah.
for a moment? And then we'll come back.
Yes.
Okay.
Let me see if I can get back to that so I can stop the share. Hold on, stop share. There we go.
Thank you, doctor. Was that the scans we were looking at, was that the MRIs or was that the MRIs and PET scans combined?
No, that was the MRI. A PET scan was very different, and I will show you a PET scan at some point. But you'll see a PET scan was nothing like it, and a PET scan is really not a primary tool to evaluate the brain. It's a very secondary tool, experimental tool we very rarely use. But we do use it occasionally, and I will discuss it. But nonetheless, that was the MRI, which is the gold standard.
And let me ask you about the MRI. If someone was to use diffusion tensor imaging, which is abbreviated DTI, is that a procedure that would be used in your medical profession that is supported by your medical profession, sir?
No, diffusion tensor imaging was developed about 15 years ago, and it's an experimental technique. There's two organizations that govern radiology, the American College of Radiology and the Radiological Society of North America. And in March of this year, the Radiological Society of North America said you can't use DTI to evaluate the brain for injury. For the same reason, the American College of Radiology said the exact same statement last December. The reason is, per their statement, not my opinion, there's too much variability, meaning normal people have abnormal DTIs and abnormal people have normal ones. So we can't use it on an individual person, and it's not acceptable to be used for diagnosing or evaluating traumatic brain injury. It's experimental, it's a very interesting technique. It looks for the integrity of the white matter, how the connections in the brain may be functioning, and it's experimental. It is being used at a handful of institutions for surgical planning when people have tumors to see how the nerves, where they course, and maybe do more successful surgery. It is not used in any trauma centers in this country to evaluate the traumatic brain injury. It's being used experimentally, and some outpatient centers use it. Unfortunately, it's being misapplied in the medical legal arena where people try to make claims based on that, and frequently I have to intervene and try to make sure people understand what you can and can't use it for. It's very interesting. You could say populations of people may have more abnormal DTI who have certain injuries, but the answer is it's not something you can use on the individual person to diagnose or evaluate traumatic brain injury. It's not accepted by any of the major organizations.
Thank you, doctor. And if I can ask you about the PET scan, was there a PET scan that you received in this case, and did you review that, sir?
There was, and I will show you that. Can you see the image, first of all?
Yes, sir.
Good. Well, that's a good start, at least. Hold on. Okay, this is not nearly as pretty as an MRI. What a PET scan is, I know you already know all of this because someone else probably talked about it, but I'm going to give you my 30-second synopsis. You inject a radioactive glucose into a vein, and you can take pictures of any part of the body, even the whole body, seeing how fast the cells eat the glucose. You say, why would you want to do that? Usually we do it to look for cancer. Why is that? Because cancer grows faster than regular cells. They eat glucose much faster. Glucose is sugar, by the way. And we can find cancer anywhere in the body. We use PET scans for cancer detection to see where cancer is and if the treatment's working. Now, it's been applied a little bit in the brain to look for how the brain is functioning, because parts of the brain that aren't eating glucose as fast are parts of the brain that could be injured or not functioning as well. So this is the brain. The parts that are eating glucose look black. The parts in the middle are the white matter tracts. They don't eat the glucose. We're looking at the gray matter that eats the glucose. And again, this is perfectly normal. There's no areas of the brain that are abnormal. There's no areas that are white, that aren't black, that aren't supposed to be. These are areas that are supposed to be white, and those are normal parts of the brain that don't eat glucose. So without going through every little image here, again, this is stone cold normal. It couldn't be more normal. There's nothing abnormal on the PET scan. There's no areas that aren't eating glucose properly. This is a perfectly normal study.
And can I ask you if somebody were to try and compare PET scans to a control group of 16 people that was developed 15 years ago, in your profession and in your medical field, would that be a concern for you guys, and would that be something you would rely on?
Obviously, that's not acceptable. I don't think you have to be a scientist to answer that. You need thousands and thousands of people to compare it to do that. That's what science is about. It has to be statistically significant, and it has to be reproducible. Other people have to be able to evaluate that and compare it. So you need at least thousands, many hundreds, if not many thousand, to compare it to. But there's nothing to compare it to. This is normal. So you don't have to compare it to anyone in this case. But you can go ahead. Obviously, if things are mischaracterized, then you're going to come up with faulty data. When you have very small segments of data, it's very easy to come up with erroneous conclusions. So I just talking theoretically about what you're saying.
Yes, sir. And doctor, when you get the scans normally, we saw them, they're mostly grayscale, right, that you deal with?
Yes, they can be color. It makes no difference. But this is how it was performed at the facility. It wasn't done. I'm showing you what was actually done. I'm not manipulating anything or changing it. I think that's important, that you see exactly what I see.
Yes, sir. So if I can just clarify, so based on your evaluation of Mr. Hayes, he has a completely normal brain, and there's no signs of any traumatic brain injury to you at all, sir?
That is correct. And I do have one more thing to share. Hopefully I can make it appear here. You'll have to give me a moment, though. 1 minute, please. Hopefully I can make it appear. I think I can. I'll get to my screen share again. Let me close this. Let me get back to your screen. A lot of different screens here. Hold on. See if this works. I hope it does. Can you see this screen?
Yes, sir. And what is
Good.
that?
All right. We're in business. This is a NeuroQuant. This is simply a computer program developed by a company in California. I know them very, very well. They received FDA clearance, not approval, but clearance about 10 years ago to use this to evaluate the MRI exams. A handful of places. No one uses this clinically. It's done for research. What it's used for, you take the MRI study and it scans the MRI and looks for areas of the brain that may be shrunken up. And because if you have a shrunken up brain, that can be a sign the brain is injured or not, or something's wrong. And up until recently, we use this for Alzheimer's disease, because people with Alzheimer's disease have a certain part of the brain called the hippocampus that frequently is more shrunken up than other people. So that was the main reason NeuroQuant came about 15 years ago. Now people have tried to apply this to some other thing, traumatic brain injury. If you have a traumatic brain injury, within a year, frequently your brain starts shrinking at a more rapid rate than normal people, because it's not functioning right. And the whole brain can shrink up, or certain parts of the brain can shrink up. And on this study, those spots would look red. Now you might say, oh, I see some red spots. Well, everybody's going to have some red and some blue. Blue means they're larger than average. Red means they're smaller. So when you measure tiny little spots in the brain, there's a lot of variation. I've read many, many thousands of these. I've never seen someone who didn't have red and blue spots. That's why you have to go back and look at the MRI and correlate it. You don't read this in a vacuum and make any conclusion. These don't mean anything, and they're not an accepted technique for making any diagnosis. You have to correlate it with the PET scans and the MRI. You don't look at things in a vacuum. And the answer is having a couple tiny spots of red when the MRI is normal doesn't mean anything clinically. And having areas that are large never means anything. Larger than normal or larger than average is just how you're measuring things, and it's perfectly normal. If the brain was swollen from a recent injury, it could look larger, and that would be an exception. Or if you had epilepsy or a seizure and the brain was swollen when you did this study, that could explain an area being larger, but that's not the case here. But these areas that are blue are very normal. That means they're perfectly large and even bigger than average for size. Some people have tried to misapply that, saying larger areas of the brain have abnormal pruning, meaning when people were born, some of the brain didn't form right. Well, there's never been any study to say such a thing, and we couldn't measure it because that's a microscopic level. Pruning doesn't cause certain parts of the brain to be larger than you can measure using NeuroQuant. This is not that detailed a study. This is simply a computer that measures grossly larger areas of the brain. Synaptic pruning, where the brain forms in childhood and adolescence, that's a microscopic process. This can't measure that, and that's not what these numbers are for. So that would be a misapplication to try to make a diagnosis. This is a normal study, having read many thousands of NeuroQuants. You couldn't really get a much more normal study. There's no brain shrunken up that's not functioning properly.
I'm sorry, I'm not hearing the one word he's calling it, a neuroquant. What's he calling it?
NeuroQuant, Neuroquant. That's just the name of a company that does these. It's called the NeuroQuant Company. If you ever Google it, they're out in California. That's just the name of the company that's developed this software. And again, It looks for areas of the brain that are shrunken up. And this person doesn't have a shrunken up brain, as we can see from the regular MRI, which is considered the gold standard.
Yes, sir. And just a follow-up, one last question. Is it acceptable in the medical profession or in your profession to utilize either MRIs or PET scans to diagnose autism?
No, we don't have an imaging technique to diagnose autism. That's where I was going with that. I think people have misapplied. I've seen some people make comments that they can use neuroquant by seeing parts of the brain that are bigger. Autism, there's theories that it's caused by synaptic pruning, meaning when you're a child, maybe as your body is cleaning up the brain and it's forming, certain things don't form right. But we can't see that. That's a microscopic process. You can't see that on an MRI or on a neuroquant. What you can see it maybe is on a functional MRI, which is not something anyone in this country except for research institutions can do. It's a special technique where the computer can see how the brain is functioning using MRI. That's not done here, and that's just an experimental technique. We're trying to figure out how the brain functions. You know, you cannot diagnose autism, or else we'd be doing it all the time, trying to figure out who has autism. And I've practiced neuroradiology for 28 years, and I've never been asked or seen anyone try to diagnose autism using any imaging study because we don't have that capability and have any findings that correlate with autism, unfortunately. It would be nice if we could.
Yes, sir. Thank you, doctor. I don't have any other questions. I appreciate it.
Sure.
Any cross-examination? I'm going to have you come up here so he can hear you. Hey, Bill, can you grab that remote and move it away so it doesn't hit the ground? I don't know what it belongs to, but.
Which microphone am I using? This one?
Yeah, that's fine. Actually, this is the one that's picking up, but
Okay.
the one right there.
You gotta move this closer forward, is that one?
Yeah, that'll help out.
Oh, that one?
No, that's good. That's good, right there. You can slide it down a little bit if you need to use a banister to rest your work. There you go.
Is it Dr. Nagin? Did I say that right?
You did very well, better than most people. Thank you.
Have you ever been a professor of psychiatry at a college?
No, I'm a radiologist. I am not a psychiatrist. My training is a radiologist. I'm a medical doctor in radiology.
Okay. Have you ever worked in a university neurocognitive imaging center?
No, I work in private practice. Florida Radiology Consultant is the name of my practice. I've been in this practice for 28 years.
And you've never been a clinical director of a brain imaging center, have you?
Yeah, I've been the medical director for Florida Radiology Consultants for all the imaging for almost 15 years.
For a brain imaging center?
Correct, yes. It's for the neurologist here in Fort Myers.
Which one?
Florida Radiology Consultants. We have outpatient centers that are dedicated to Florida Neurology Group. If you see on my CV, I provide all the medical directors for the Florida Neurology Group in Fort Myers for approximately 15 years.
Okay. But my question was a brain imaging center, not a neurology center.
We do the brain imaging for the neurologist. I'm the one who oversees the imaging for the brain imaging, me personally.
Okay, in places that do complete neurology, not just concentrated solely on brain imaging, correct?
That's correct, yeah.
Okay. Now, how much are you paid to be here today?
$3,500.
How much do you charge an hour?
There's no hourly charge, but normally to review imaging in cases is $500 an hour, which is pretty much standard for a neuroradiologist to review imaging or medical record.
So the $3,500 is just a flat fee for you to get today's work, right?
That is correct.
Okay. And you're just gonna spend about an hour in court today. That works out about $3,500 an hour, right?
Not exactly. I've been waiting all afternoon, whether you realize that or not. I was told I would be testifying at 3 o'clock. I had to take the day off today. I actually had someone cover for me. So if it was that simple, I wouldn't be charging that. You're correct. But unfortunately, I have to set aside a lot of time because these lawyers, you know how lawyers are, very verbose. They don't tend to, trials don't go as quickly as you would like, and I have to set aside a lot of time.
I never thought I'd hear a doctor say lawyers are verbose. You don't do quantitative analysis. You don't do QSA, do you?
I do neuroquant, so I'm not sure what you mean by quantitative analysis. Maybe I need
I
to
think
clarify that.
I left out a word. You don't do quantitative statistical analysis, do you? QSA.
Of what?
Quantitative statistical analysis.
I don't know what that is, so I guess not. I'm not sure what you're referring to.
Let me make sure I'm saying it correctly. If I may just ask my own person, I may be saying the word wrong. All right, doctor, I'll ask it. I think I got the word wrong, but you don't do MRI DTI work, do you?
Yes, I review it almost a daily basis.
PET scans
Again, I review them daily.
and tractographic analysis of the corpus callosum.
Callosum, yes, I review these things daily. This is what I do as a neuroradiologist. We don't use DTI at our facility to diagnose traumatic brain injury, as almost no facilities do in this country. We have a level 2 trauma center because it's not an accepted technique. Outside of the University of Miami and Johns Hopkins, which do it experimentally, I'm not sure there's too many institutions, I can't name any off the top of my head, even trauma centers that are using it to diagnose or evaluate traumatic brain injury. It is being done experimentally, and I think the answer to this will be very different 5 years from now because it's great technology, and we're still learning how to apply it, but on an individual level, it's not acceptable for all the major radiology societies to be applying it in a manner it is being attempted to here, I suspect.
All right. And is it fair to say that the universities are on the cutting edge of science? The kinds of science that results in the standard practices in your radiology profession eventually, right?
I have no idea. I think you'd have to be more specific. I don't know how to answer that. I don't know if there's a specific question you have. There's research being done everywhere, including at my facility where I work. I'm not a researcher personally. I do clinical work, but there's research being done all over. And DTI is a great area of research. I think it's a great technology. I'm fascinated by it, and I opine on it almost every day, in legal matters and non-legal matters.
And have you done any quantitative statistical analysis as applied in brain scanning, whether it's MRIs, PET scans, anything? Have you done any type of work and contributed to any scholarly journals in that area?
No, I don't do research. I'm not a public.
Okay. And I take it also you have not published any neuroimaging publications or papers, correct?
No, I have. When I was in training, I published the largest paper ever published on vertebroplasty, which is treating compression fractures in the spine. It's still the authoritative article 25 years later. If you Google my name, and I used to do interventional neuroradiology, and I used to inject cement into people's spine to treat their compression fractures. I was the first one in the state of Florida. Now it's become a national technique, a worldwide technique, and I was the one who pioneered that.
And that publication is 25 years old?
That is correct. I have been in private practice since then. I haven't done any publishing or research in the last 25 years.
Nothing in the last 10 years?
Not in the last 25 years.
Not in the last 5 years?
Not in the last 25 years. That's correct.
Okay. You mentioned that a majority of your work has been for the defense. Am I correct on that?
In these types of cases, yes, probably 2/3 to 3/4 of the time of the cases that review and testify have been for the defense. That's correct. Just last week I testified for the defense.
Okay, and how much of that has been insurance defense?
I was talking about death penalty cases. I thought you meant death penalty cases and sentencing cases. I was specifically referring to those types of cases.
Okay.
If you want to talk about personal injury, medical malpractice, yeah, I can certainly clarify all of that. I apologize if I wasn't clear or didn't understand the question, apparently.
Yeah, let's talk about IMEs. You've done IMEs, right?
I have what? I'm sorry?
IMEs. Independent medical.
I don't do
exam.
IMEs. IMEs when you examine a patient. I've never done an IME, no.
You've never-
I do radiology reviews, which is not an IME. That's
Okay.
not an independent medical evaluation. I don't examine patients. That's not what a radiologist does. I do radiology reviews for medical malpractice cases, which about 70% of the time I've been on the plaintiff's side. I do them for insurance companies, people in accidents, where about 85% of the time I'm on the defense side. So I do all types of reviews. I do child abuse evaluation,
All right.
all types of cases on a national level.
Let's-
I don't pick and choose the side.
Let's stop right there, okay. So 85% of your civil work is on the defense side, right?
For personal injury matter.
Right.
Yes.
And so, and essentially, your job is to refute some plaintiff's doctor's work that has found an injury. That's what you do when you're...
Absolutely not true. No.
Okay, come on.
My job is to tell them what the imaging shows. More than half the time, I tell them there's an injury that could be related to the incident. As I testified today, this morning, and I told them it was related to the incident and gave testimony as such, and they decide what to do with it. They don't use me as a witness some of those cases, or they settle the case. But they don't want to go to trial and refute something in an insurance company if they have liability. My job is to tell them what their liability is. That's why they hire them. The other side doesn't hire a witness, but they already have someone who's making a claim. So my job is not to refute anything. I have no skin in the game. I don't get paid based on outcomes. I get paid by the hour to review things. My testimony has never been challenged in 28 years. It's always honest and truthful, and I can only tell you what I see. I don't make the image.
Oh, okay, Dr. Hagen. You're working on a civil case, which is also in common knowledge referred to as a car crash case. Those are very common. Wouldn't you say in the civil side of your work? Car crash cases.
Car crash, slip and falls, all kinds of injuries. Yes, many different types of injuries.
Okay, the stuff that we see on the TV and the billboards all over the place, right?
Some of those, yeah.
Okay. And so the plaintiff gets hurt or says they're hurt, and they go to a doctor and they have radiological reviews and reports done, and you review those reports, right?
No, I don't. I don't review the reports. As the case I testified in this morning, I never saw the reports. I just review the imaging, and I tell them what's on the imaging, and whether or not I think it may be something wrong at all, and whether or not I think it's related to the incident. Then the people who I've given the opinions to decide what to do with it, which they may settle the case, they may challenge the case, they may use me as a witness, they may say, goodbye, Dr. Megan. My opinions are not helpful or supportive of their case. Many different scenarios play out. Most of the time, they don't use me as a witness, either giving testimony or in trial, a very small percentage of the time, because they settle the cases or whatever happens, I don't know. I'm not privy to it.
Okay. And so for those defense medical x-ray reviews that you do for car crash cases and slip and falls and those kinds of things, you get paid by an insurance company, right?
It's actually a insurance company or a third party. They usually hire a law firm to handle it, but I'm paid by someone on the defense side in those cases.
Okay,
Correct.
and you know the money's coming from an insurance company, right? Eventually. That money that gets paid you for your independent radiological exam and car crash cases on the defense side, that money's coming from insurance companies, right?
I don't know who it comes from, nor do I care. It doesn't matter to me where the money's coming from.
Could be the tooth fairy, right?
There you go.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure it's not though, because they don't push me at 1099. But if it was,
All right. And so in those cases, which are, I believe you said 75% of your work is on the defense side, right? Of those car crash cases.
actually, it's a little more than that. A little more than that.
Okay, 80%. And in those cases, you do your independent, or your defense independent, call it what you want, your review of the radiological work. You write a report, and then...
No, I don't write a report in any of the cases. I don't put my opinions in writing unless it's asked for, which is only 10% of the time. Because most of the time, my opinions are not supportive of the side that hires me. Most of the time, you need to. I don't know if you're hearing what I'm saying. So they don't want me to put it in writing, and they don't continue to use me in those cases. It's only the small percentage that I'm able to provide an opinion they find helpful that I give testimony or get involved in a trial. Most of the time, my opinions are either non-supportive or non-contributory to their case.
Because most of the time, you say, yeah, these injuries are real. They're not faking it, right?
I have no idea about faking. I can't tell if someone has symptoms. I say there is findings on there that I can't tell if they're related to the incident or maybe related to the incident. Yes, that's correct. I tell them they have liability and they go ahead and settle the case, or they don't list me as a witness. I have no idea. I'm not a lawyer. I don't know what they decide or how to handle it. I can only tell them what I see and give them an honest evaluation of what they asked me to do. They want to know what their risks and liabilities are.
All right. Now, you know what statistical analysis is, right? When I just tell you about
Theoretically, yes, theoretically doing statistics. I remember statistics from probably college. Well, and I might have done it in medical school a little bit, but mostly in college, I do remember statistics, yeah.
Okay, so it's real enough that they taught a little of it to you in medical school, right?
It's nothing to do with radiology, what I do, doing statistics. I'm a radiologist. In clinical practice, we don't use statistics, other than if I'm going to look at a study to see how well it's performed, to see if the findings are statistically significant, but I'm not a statistician. I'm a diagnostic radiologist and a neuroradiologist.
Now, you mentioned DTI. And did I hear you correctly? You said it's still experimental, it's not accepted?
I didn't say that. The American College of Radiology came out with a definitive paper, a white paper, as a matter of fact. If you want to Google it, it's called the Imaging Guidelines for Traumatic Brain Injury. And it was last updated December of 2020. And it says on page 22 at the bottom that DTI cannot and should not be used in the evaluation of traumatic brain injury at the individual patient level because of variation. 3 months after that, the Radiological Society of North America, RSNA, the biggest radiology society in the world, that's in the world, came out with a one-page summary saying DTI is experimental and should not be applied at individual level for the exact same reason, the variation in the result, and it cannot be used to diagnose an individual person with evaluation of traumatic brain injury. And as such, I'm very careful how I use DTI at an individual level, based on those recommendations. These are not my conclusions or recommendations. I ascribe to the major radiology societies, and I follow their guidelines explicitly.
All right, so, but then you said DTI is being used in surgery.
That's correct. I just said it can't be used for traumatic brain injury. Those would be it can be used for other things. It's an experimental technique. The fiber track, you can see where the fiber tracks run to try to use surgery, to try to see when you take out a tumor, where the tracks are. But it can't be used for diagnosing traumatic brain injury in an individual person. You have to be careful what you apply these technologies for. You don't want to misuse something just because you have data and information. How you apply it is critical. And that's why these societies felt obligated to come out with these statements, very strong statements and definitive statements that weren't wishy-washy, to prevent people from misusing information that's still experimental and being determined how to apply it. Many articles written on it. We're trying to learn it. And I think 5 or 10 years from now, if you ask me these questions, I think we'll have a different discussion. But today, that's where we're at.
Well, it's fair to say that DTI is not being used in your car crash and slip and fall cases, right?
Not being used anywhere. I'm just telling you what it is being used in those cases, inappropriately sometimes. No matter which side hires me, I tell them that. It's being used all the time. Way too much and inappropriately, unfortunately. The point is, it shouldn't be.
Only in surgery? Is that what you think the only appropriate use of DTI is?
It's not what I think. I have no opinion. I don't give personal opinion. I can only quote what the Radiology Society of North America and the American College of Radiology say. So I can only quote what the literature says and the major societies, not individual random articles. They've taken all the articles for the last 10 years to come up with these statements. These are definitive white paper statements, meaning they're a summary of all the research done in the last 10 or 20 years. And this is their conclusion. The two most recognized and authoritative radiology societies in North America and possibly the world. And this is their conclusion. They're not my conclusion. I have no conclusion. Who am I to make a conclusion? It wouldn't matter what I say.
And what you said a moment ago, you're not qualified to give an opinion on that subject.
I'm the most qualified of anyone in the country. I've done more research and of the literature. I wouldn't be qualified based on my research. I don't pretend that I can do enough research and go over every article ever published. I rely on the major organizations and their recommendations. No one is qualified, no individual radiologist to make a summation and stand up and proclaim they know more than the Radiology Society of North America or the American College of Radiology. I would never proclaim that. If there's someone out there who's the smartest guy in the world, touche to them. But there's no one else who's ever been able to do so.
Wow, that was a lot. I think you said 1 minute you're the most qualified, and then the next breath you were saying you're the least qualified. Did I miss something there?
You did. Let me make it clear then, if I was unclear. No individual is qualified to make conclusions about how to apply technologies. I know as much, if not more than almost anybody about this topic. So my qualifications are my knowledge about the topic. I'm not here to make a conclusion. I rely on the major societies who have reviewed all the literature. This is not my analysis. Then it would just be my opinion. But this is the opinion of the major organization. There's no individual who can trump those opinions. Not me, not anybody.
And you're not just a neurological radiologist, you're a general radiologist as well, right?
Absolutely. About 40% of the time I practice neuroradiology, and 60% of the time I practice all general radiology of every body part. When someone has a trauma, I read their abdomen, their chest. I do all radiology. That's correct.
Okay, so somebody could be in a car crash and they could come to you and they could have you interpret an x-ray to find out if they've got a broken leg, right?
Absolutely. We'll be doing that in about 1 hour. In about 1 hour, I'll be looking at broken legs, most likely.
And then they could have you look at a thoracic spine x-ray and get you to give an interpretation whether they have a broken back or not, right?
That's going to happen in the next hour or two, for sure.
Okay. And then they could have you look at their brain and look at an MRI of the brain, right?
And that's going to happen as well tonight, for sure.
So it's like one-stop shopping, right?
Yes, that's how radiology works in the real world. In clinical practice, you can't have someone only can interpret a brain. Radiologists are trained to interpret all body parts. That's the field I'm in. And I have subspecialty training in neuroradiology. That's what a fellowship is for. We have 25 radiologists in our group. We're all fellowship trained in different areas. 5 of us are neuroradiologists. So if there's a hard case or a challenging case, they have me read the neuroradiology cases. If there's a case of a prostate MRI, that's not my expertise. But if you might have prostate cancer, or someone in the room has prostate cancer and they get an MRI, it won't be me reading it. Because you know what? That's not my expertise. So we let the people with more expertise read those types of studies. My expertise is neuroradiology, so I read a disproportionate amount of that.
That's all I have.
Thank you. Any redirect?
No, sir, not one question.
Thank you, Dr. Nagin. You're free to go.
Thank you.
Okay, State, you have another witness?
We do, Judge. Do you want to take a 5-minute break or you want to keep on?
I want to finish today. Okay, all right, let's take a 10-minute break and then come back, okay? Cameras. Yeah. All right, clear. Okay, jury's out. We'll be in recess 10 minutes.
Sir, we're ready to rock and roll right after that.
He was.
I'm sorry?
We have a matter I need to call the court's attention.
You have a what?
A matter I need to bring to the court's attention.
Okay.
Your Honor, we would move to call Dr. Wu back for survival for these reasons. Dr. Nagan just testified that there's no support for the use of DTI on patients, and that's flatly wrong. I have Dr. Wu here who will testify that there is indeed support for the use of DTI on patients. It's being done and it's supported. Secondly, Dr. Nagan testified that
Wait, you want cerebral right in the middle of the state's case? Or you want to wait till they're finished?
well, I'll just mention it now, and I can renew it later, or wait until the end of the.
Let's take care of witnesses, and we'll deal with Dr. Wu's at the appropriate time.
Okay.
Let's call the jury, please.
Jerry?
Oh, they're down there, so we're, see right there, we're sitting next to that.
We can probably move that back out.
It was the wire.
Yeah, I know.
No, I was just trying to show him where the air was coming in
Oh.
at, because he said, you're cold, I said, yeah.
We're live.
Very well. State, call your next witness.
Who we call Dr. Danziger?
Who?
Dr. Danziger?
Okay, come forward, please.
You solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you shall give in this cause will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you.
Doctor? So it's 2 steps, sir? Thank you. Good afternoon, Your Honor.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Make sure you pull the microphone in your direction, please. Speak loud and clear so the viewers can hear what you have to say. Let's proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Whenever you're ready, Doctor.
I am.
You are. Lucky enough to be the fourth expert witness on a day full of expert witnesses tonight. Do you please state your entire name and spell it for the court reporter, sir?
My name is Jeffrey Danziger, Jeffrey Danziger.
And doctor, what do you do for work?
I am a psychiatrist.
And where do you work?
My office is in Maitland, Florida. So if you're heading down I-4 to Orlando, I live and work off of exit 90 in Maitland.
And what is your business called, or who do you work for?
My business is called Psychiatric Affiliates. It's basically my wife and I, so we work for ourselves.
tell the jury about your education in your field, sir?
I'm from South Florida. After I graduated high school in Dade County, I attended Harvard College, Cambridge, Mass., and I graduated from Harvard with a bachelor's degree in biology in 1978. I then went back to Miami, to the University of Miami Medical School, and I graduated with my MD, my medical degree, in 1982. I then went to St. Louis, Missouri, to the Washington University School of Medicine, where I spent 4 years doing a residency in psychiatry. You can think of a residency as an apprenticeship for young doctors. It's where we basically learn how to be doctors. I finished that in 1986, spent 1 year on the faculty of the medical school, and then I came back to my home state of Florida. And I've been in the Orlando area in Central Florida since 1987.
Would it be fair to say that you do a decent amount of work within the judicial system in Central Florida as a whole, including Volusia, Seminole, and Orange?
I do. Now, I still have a patient practice. I was treating patients yesterday in the office, so I'm still a treating doctor as a psychiatrist. But I do quite a bit of forensic work meaning giving opinions in legal cases, whether it's civil, criminal. What I'm doing today is forensic psychiatry. So a lot of my work is on the I-4 corridor, so to speak, between Tampa and Daytona. But I've certainly been up here in this courthouse and the one in Daytona many times over the years, and I know my way to the jail over on Red John Boulevard.
Now, do you work for basically both sides? Have you worked for the prosecution and for the defense in criminal matters?
Actually, less for the prosecution. Probably a third of the time, if someone's charged with a crime, it's the judge that asks me to see them, either for are they competent to stand trial, their mental state at the time of the offense, or sentencing issues. Much of the time, it's actually defense attorneys who retain me. They ask me to see somebody. Sometimes my opinions help them, sometimes doesn't. It's probably less than 10% of the time it's actually a state attorney that asks me to evaluate someone. So this is actually less common for me. But again, when I'm retained by a defense attorney, sometimes my opinions are helpful to their case. Sometimes I say, not this time.
And have you testified before as an expert and given opinions in regard to forensic psychiatry?
Have I testified?
As an expert, yes, sir.
Going back to 1987, probably 1,000 times in circuit and criminal courts, mostly in the I-4 corridor, but everywhere from Key West to Pensacola.
And in this case, were you retained by the state of Florida?
I was on August 17, 2021.
And what was your hourly rate for the state of Florida in this case?
$300 per hour.
And were you given any materials to review in this case?
I was.
What materials were you given, sir?
I'll try and do it briefly. I was given information from the detectives and investigators of these various murders in both Palm Beach County and here in Volusia County. I was given the records of Mr. Hayes, his academic records from Bethune-Cookman University, Cordon Bleu, University of North Carolina, the Palm Beach County High Schools. I listened to audios of 2 interviews conducted with Mr. Hayes in 2019 by detectives in Palm Beach County. There were some medical records I looked at from North Carolina, the Carolina Medical Center, Atrium Health, Pineville. I also read the reports of Dr. Eisenstein and Dr. Nicole Graham. And then, of course, I had the opportunity to interview Mr. Hayes last week.
Before we get into any opinions you formed and into the interview of Mr. Hayes, I want you to talk to the jury a little bit about autism. What is the mental disorder of autism?
Autism is a diagnosis that begins in childhood. And there's 2 main facets to autism. The first is deficits in social communication and social interaction. If we think about when we were children, or those of you who have children of your own, when they're babies, they don't know how to interact with others. But they learn They establish friendships. They understand if they do things, people react positively or negatively, and they adapt their behavior to that. They learn to understand people's facial expressions. The things that we do when we're boring somebody or making somebody happy or upset, we understand these things either through nonverbal communication or through facial expressions. People with autism lack that ability. They can't put themselves in the mind of somebody else. We call them mind blind. It starts often in childhood. They may seem somewhat off, distant. They aren't able to establish friendships. They don't seem to understand how their actions impact others. They don't understand facial expressions. They often don't understand sarcasm. And we see this as people grow older. I'll give an example. If you were driving home on I-95 tonight or on Speedway Boulevard and you ran over some nails and had 2 flat tires, you pulled over and you said, well, isn't that just wonderful? You and I would know that's sarcasm. But somebody with autism would say, why are you saying that's wonderful? It doesn't make sense. They take things literally. They do not understand sarcasm. They don't understand everything is literal. And they simply don't understand the basic rules of social communication. They're often thought of as different, aloof, poor interactions with others. So that's one facet of autism.
What's the next facet?
The second key facet is restricted and repetitive patterns of behaviors or interests that are abnormal in intensity. So they may have one narrow focus that they know everything about and just bore people endlessly. Example, I had one patient who knew everything in the world about Legos. You know, Legos, those little building blocks. All he would talk about all day long was Legos. He'd talk for hours endlessly. People would try to roll their eyes, look at their watch. He wouldn't stop. He got hired at the Lego theme park, think it was his dream job. They had to let him go because he kept annoying all the customers, telling them, wouldn't let them buy things. People with autism may have this narrow focus. They may insist on sameness. Their food has to be in a certain way on the plate. Everything is certain rituals. Everything has to be the same. They may be fascinated by parts of objects. They may have odd collections, bottle caps, sticks. So there's very unusual patterns of behavior where a failure in social communication and interaction, they can't put themselves in the mind of others or understands how other people perceive their actions, which interfere with their social functioning, and then these very odd and restricted patterns of behavior. And one of the keys of the diagnosis is that it starts in what we call the early developmental phase, childhood. May not be diagnosed in childhood, but looking back, you can see there were problems. They were picked on. They never were able to establish friendships. When they got into adolescence, they never had a date. They never had any romantic partners. They try, but they don't seem to understand the social rules and social conventions, despite often having average intelligence. So these are the things we look for in diagnosing autism.
And how is autism normally diagnosed in your experience?
It's diagnosed clinically. People have trouble with interactions socially, or they engage in odd behaviors. They may be brought to their pediatrician. They may be brought to a psychiatrist or psychologist. There are some psychological tests that can be done, sometimes testing the person themselves. Sometimes you get information from their parents and teachers, and you try to put the whole picture together. And again, autism can vary in severity from relatively mild forms. The more severe forms, it's obvious something's wrong. People may never develop language, and in that case, it's very obvious that there's something wrong if people are unable to speak, if it's a more severe variant. But often it's diagnosed by pediatricians, child psychologists, child psychiatrists. Often teachers who observe things may bring this to the attention. This is how it's diagnosed, again, often made in childhood and adolescence, sometimes not made till adulthood, but in retrospect, you can look back and see that problems existed going back to childhood.
And are you familiar with it being diagnosed by brain scan?
No. The idea that you can just look at a brain scan and diagnose someone without having to speak with them, no. Now, research may show there are things that may show up in people with autism. There may be some changes, but the idea that you can look at a brain scan and say, aha, this person has autism, I don't even need to see them. No, autism is a diagnosis made by clinical interview and by history.
Now, doctor, you said in this case you did have an opportunity to meet with the defendant.
Yes, on February 26th, just this past Saturday.
And where was that meeting?
That was at the Volusia Branch Jail on Red Bug Road, just off of Speedway.
And how long did this meeting with Mr. Hayes last?
A little over 2 hours.
And what observations did you make of Mr. Hayes during your interview with him, sir?
Mr. Hayes presents as a very bright individual, very articulate, good vocabulary, excellent grammar, likely above average intelligence, as evidenced by consistent with the testing. No obvious psychiatric history, certainly not hearing voices, nothing to suggest mania. Somewhat upset and depressed, understandably, about the current situation, which is hardly unexpected given the circumstances he's in. But he really denied to me any significant history of mental illness. His mental status examination was essentially normal for someone facing the circumstances we're in today. Basically saying, I'm innocent and I want to prove my innocence eventually, and I'm in this situation, but nothing to suggest active psychiatric illness when I met with him, nothing to suggest intellectual or cognitive problems, essentially a normal examination for someone in his situation.
Let me ask you, doctor, you said he appeared to you to be intelligent.
Yes.
And in your experience, have you examined individuals charged with homicide throughout your career?
Over probably 250 people. Not all of them were capital sentencing death penalty cases. Going back 35 years, I've probably seen 200, 250 people charged with murder.
And how does he compare in terms of his intelligence, based upon your review of the records and your interview with him, compared to these other individuals you've spoken with?
The bulk of the people I've seen have been of below average intelligence. Often they were in special education, did not complete high school, generally of lower intellectual ability. Not all of them. Mr. Hayes is somewhat unusual, and he's someone who's of above average intelligence. And that's somewhat uncommon in people I've seen, my own personal experience, charged with murder.
Did you observe any behavior from Mr. Hayes during your meeting to indicate to you that he was autistic or suffering from autism?
No. My understanding, certainly his ability to interact with me, look me in the eye, speak with me, he didn't demonstrate this sort of aloofness, poor eye contact, soft signs I might expect to see in someone. He looked me right in the eye and was very forthright in putting forth his findings and his history. I'm not aware of anything in his past to show that he wasn't able to establish friendships, that he had unusual collecting abilities, unusual hoarding, narrow focus on single topics that he would talk endlessly about. I didn't see anything in his history suggestive of autism. I'll also note I looked at the testing done by Dr. Eisenstein and by Dr. Graham. Sometimes individuals with autism, on some of the testing, it may show up. These are people who are very introverted, socially isolated, uncomfortable in social situations. You might see that on tests such as the Minnesota Multiphasic Test or the PAI, Personality Assessment Inventory. Those tests didn't show that. Again, you don't diagnose autism from any one test, but looking at the whole picture, Mr. Hayes, in my opinion, there's nothing to suggest going back to childhood, a pattern of a life arc suggestive of an autism disorder. It just isn't there.
You may have already stated, but in your analysis and your opinion of Mr. Hayes, were you able to diagnose him with anything out of the DSM-5, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorder?
The only thing I diagnosed him with was something called an adjustment disorder, which is the development of emotional or behavioral symptoms in response to an identifiable stressor. Well, what's the stressor here? When I saw him, he'd just been found guilty of first-degree murder. That's a pretty big stressor. And I think it would be anybody in that situation, I'd expect them to have some worry, apprehension, upset. I think he has that. I called it an adjustment disorder, but an adjustment disorder by definition means they don't meet criteria for any other psychiatric diagnosis. So I didn't see a major depressive disorder. He said he has hope, he doesn't feel worthless, he's not suicidal, he sees things to live for. I did not see a full-blown major depression. Nothing to suggest any other psychiatric diagnosis, in my opinion, other than his reaction to the current situation. I also based that, again, I looked at what Dr. Eisenstein wrote, I looked at what Dr. Graham wrote. They did some what are called projective tests, meaning tests of people's emotional state. Those tests showed he didn't have a psychiatric diagnosis, not depression, anxiety, mania, schizophrenia. So the testing done by other experts, at least for psychiatric issues such as depression, anxiety, mania, so forth, came out clean. Didn't show active psychiatric diagnosis. My own interview, other than a reasonable and appropriate reaction to being found guilty of the charges here, no other psychiatric diagnosis other than a reasonable response to situation. So other than that situational reaction, called an adjustment disorder, I didn't see any other DSM-5 diagnosis.
Doctor, you talked about testifying in other murder cases. You have testified in other death penalty cases, right?
Yes, I have.
And are you familiar with mitigators that are outlined in Section 921.141 of the Florida statutes?
Yes, and I have testified to them in the past, yes.
And based upon everything you looked at in this case and your expert opinion, is there any indication that this defendant committed the crimes in this case because he was under the influence of extreme mental or emotional distress?
None that could be found.
Can you explain why? That's your conclusion.
And again, the definition of extreme mental, I leave that to you all. But what do I look for if I'm trying to see what was somebody's mental state at the time of an offense? Do we have psychiatric records? In other words, right before or right after the crime, were they at the hospital at Stuart Marchman? Were they in the psychiatric unit at Halifax Hospital here? Were they seeing a psychiatrist or psychologist who has notes very near in time to the incident? Because we're trying to reconstruct somebody's mental state at some point in the past. So are there records to show mental illness? Not present here. The other thing I look at, sometimes people are arrested immediately after a crime, and they're brought to the jail. And what happens at the jail? They get screened by jail medical people, maybe by jail mental health. So if someone committed a crime on a Tuesday morning, they're arrested, and Tuesday afternoon they're seen by jail mental health noting this person's hearing voices, they're paranoid, they're confused. That gives me something very close in time. That's a real clue for me trying to put their mental state together. And the other thing I ask people is, well, what were you thinking when you committed the crime? Why did you do it? And they might say, I thought the person was trying to attack me, or I was under the influence of drugs, or I hadn't taken my psychiatric medicine for 3 weeks and I was hearing voices telling me. These are things I look at when I'm trying to look back in time and say, what was somebody's mental state on the day they committed an offense? And in this case, were they under an extreme mental or emotional disturbance? We don't have any of that in the case of Mr. Hayes. There's no psychiatric records that I know of from late 2005, early 2006. Where was Mr. Hayes? He was a senior at Bethune-Cookman, down the street from here. He was a cheerleader. He was doing well enough in school that he graduated with his degree in 2006. We don't have any psychiatric records near in time. This is an old, he certainly wasn't brought to the jail then to be seen by anybody. And when I asked Mr. Hayes, about the offense because I wanted to ask, and I told his lawyer, Mr. Shea, I was going to ask about his mental state at the time. Mr. Hayes said, I didn't do it. I'm innocent. Okay, that's fine. Of course, he's welcome to maintain his innocence. That's not my department. But I don't have any data to show that in late 2005, early 2006, he was laboring under any mental disease or defect. He was getting any psychiatric treatment. He was doing anything other than doing well in school at Bethune-Cookman, well enough to graduate. And when I asked him, was anything going on at the time when you might have done these, he says, I didn't do them. So there is, in my opinion, zero data to show that the death of these three women took place while he was under the influence of any extreme mental or emotional disturbance. The data is not there.
And staying under those mitigating circumstances outlined in 921.141, was there any data that this defendant lacked the capacity to appreciate the criminality of his conduct or to conform his conduct to the requirements of the law?
And again, I look at much the same thing because much of what we do as a forensic psychiatrist is go back in time and say, what was somebody's mental state when something happened? What were they thinking then? And again, I look for the same things. If their capacity was substantially impaired, what would substantially impair your capacity? Well, you might be intoxicated. You might have a mental illness that's active. If you were a person who had Alzheimer's disease, maybe your capacity to appreciate things is impacted. Maybe if you'd just been hit over the head with a pipe and you were still confused, your capacity might be impaired. These are things I look at. Was there something abnormal about somebody's mental state where they either didn't know what they didn't fully appreciate what they were doing was a criminal act? And that might be, I think it's another example. Maybe, I'm trying to defend myself against someone. So maybe it's justified. I'm not aware of anything to show late 2005, early 2006, that Mr. Hayes was laboring under anything that would have prevented him from appreciating whether the deaths of these women by shooting, that he wasn't able to know that was wrong. Similarly, conforming your conduct means you can't control your impulse, that you're doing something and you just can't stop yourself. That's the ability to conform your conduct. You just can't stop. It's an impulse. Now, can that happen if somebody is intoxicated, if they just suffered a head injury 10 minutes before, if they're suffering from active symptoms of schizophrenia, if they're hearing voices commanding them to do something? Sure. That might affect your ability to control your behavior. Give an example of that. Somebody bumps into you at the grocery store. They say, excuse me. Your first impulse might be, whoa, you want to shove back at them, but you slow down, you say, no, it's just an accident, you don't punch them in the face. That's impulse control. I'm not aware of anything, again, we're looking back, 2005, 2006. I'm not aware of anything to show on those dates. Was Mr. Hayes unable to refrain, his ability to control the desire to shoot women in the head? In any way, was he unable to restrain himself from doing that? Had such a compulsion he couldn't stop himself? I don't see anything in the history to show that. So there's an absence of data when you try to reconstruct 2005, 2006. Was there extreme mental emotional disturbance? No data. Was there substantial impairment in his ability to appreciate the criminal nature of his conduct? The ability to conform that conduct, was that substantially impaired? There's no data on those dates when the murders happened to show that he was laboring under any psychiatric mental issues that would exist. That's my opinion.
Thank you, Doctor, and thank you for your patience today. I have no further questions.
Any cross-examination? Yes, sir. Why don't you stand up in place and stretch your legs out? I know it's getting late in the day, but if you want to, you don't have to, you know. And I'll stand up with you. How's that?
Me too, Your Honor.
Everybody stands up, blood flowing again. I'm gonna tell Paulita to punish Chris. Punish her, just to make things easier.
I can't condone that.
You drew gulag every day. Is she coming tomorrow? Have you spoken to her today? Today? She was doing a depot? Well, that's hard to believe. You guys don't give you that day off? Oh, yeah, there's another one going on in this building. Are you talking about this building? Oh. Oh. You were here last week. Oh, yeah, that's right. Okay, you may proceed.
Dr. Danziger.
Move the microphone close to your mouth, please.
And good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Dr. Danziger, there's an expression, autism spectrum disorder. What does that mean?
It's more than a expression, that's the actual diagnosis. If you look in the DSM-5, our Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, it says autism spectrum disorder. which refers to the fact that it can range from very mild symptoms to very severe and totally incapacitating symptoms. So it refers to the wide range of symptoms which are all within one diagnosis.
So to use some sort of pop media examples, somebody could have really severe autism like the Tom Cruise character in the movie Rain Man. Really, something's obviously very wrong to even a layperson, right?
Well, sure. For some people with autism, the more severe variants, they never develop language. They require essentially total care, or they need to be in a secure setting for their whole life. That's on the most severe end. On the higher end, people may have some impairment in functioning, but they may still be able to have very meaningful lives, careers, relationships. So it depends on the severity of symptoms and how well people adapt to it.
And you mentioned that some of the signs of autism spectrum disorder are getting picked on, right? And let me just tell you the three that I wrote down. Getting picked on, having trouble hanging on to friends and partners, and repeating patterns. Those are some of the red flags of autism, right?
Well, lots of people get bullied for one reason or another. That doesn't mean you have autism if you're getting bullied. And again, the key sort of two broad areas of autism are the very deficits in social communication interactions, and then the restricted and repetitive patterns of behavior. Those are sort of the two main areas in autism, and it starts in childhood.
And you mentioned that you saw nothing in the records that said autism to you. I'm paraphrasing it, but is that the gist of what you said?
My opinion, he, meaning Mr. Hayes, does not have autism spectrum disorder. It just isn't there.
But let's talk about the records, okay? Because you've been practicing psychiatry for how many years?
Well, in Florida, 35 years, and 5 years of training before that.
Okay. And it's fair to say that it used to be a lot easier to do your kind of work because hospitals and schools would keep records sometimes 20, 30, 40 years, right? That helped, didn't it?
No, typically records are often shredded after 7 years. Nowadays, because people don't have to store giant boxes of paper records, they just scan things, so it's all virtual. So it's easier to find records nowadays.
Okay, come on, Dr. Danziger. You know that they passed a law about 10 years ago that allowed hospitals to shred records after 10 or 12 years. Isn't that true?
I'm not aware they passed a law. I just know sometimes it's harder to get old records. I'll agree to that. If they're very old, it can be hard to get the records.
All right. And the autism spectrum disorder, you said sometimes it's not diagnosed until the patient reaches adulthood, right?
Sometimes the diagnosis is not made until adulthood. That's correct.
Okay. And you also said that a brain scan alone cannot identify autism. You said that a clinical history is needed and interviews are needed, correct?
I don't believe you can diagnose autism from a brain scan alone without interviewing somebody. And again, since it requires that the symptoms were present in early developmental period, meaning childhood, you need to get information from childhood up to the present. You can't diagnose autism just by looking at a brain image. You just can't do it.
And you yourself had, what, a 2-hour jail interview with him, right?
Correct.
Okay. You didn't do any testing, did you?
I didn't, because so much testing had already been done.
Now, you said that one of the flags or indicators of autism is being obsessed with things, fixating on things, Legos and the like. Remember that?
Well, Legos was one example. The idea is it's an unusual focus on something abnormal in intensity or focus. So it might be trains or Legos or old movies or knowing everything about Star Wars or Star Trek or everything about McDonald's Happy Meals or just some narrow focus that is unusual and abnormal in intensity.
And that would include an abnormal, intense focus on sex. It could, right?
Lots of people have abnormal focus on sex, and that doesn't mean they're autistic.
But an extreme focus and obsession with sex could be a sign, right?
I don't think I've ever seen that. I've seen people who have psychosexual disorders who may keep getting into trouble with their spouses and partners, or they may have some sort of sexual disorder that gets them into trouble with the law. But typically, if you're having a great deal of sex, it suggests you have the ability to interact with people, you understand social conventions, you can convince people to want to be with you in some intimate relationship. Usually people with autism struggle to have romantic and sexual relationships, so it would be less typical.
And usually people with autism spectrum disorders, if I understood you correctly, have trouble hanging on to friends, hanging on to partners.
Well, they have trouble establishing those friendships in the first place because they don't understand how their actions are perceived by others. People may think them odd or peculiar, and they try to make friends often, but people don't seem to like them because they don't understand the rules of social interaction. They bore people, they act oddly, so they have difficulty establishing and maintaining those relationships due to their lack of knowledge of social rules and conventions.
All right, and did you review the life history investigation report prepared by Betty Fuentes in this case? A couple of other of the state's experts have talked about this document.
I was not supplied with that. I know that, I think it was in Dr. Graham's report, she summarized that, but I did not see the original document.
All right, well, it indicates that Mr. Hayes had 21 different jobs between 1996 and June of 2019. He couldn't hold a job. Wouldn't that be one of the indicators of an inability to form normal human relationships that last?
Well, it would depend why he quit the jobs. Was he bored? Did he not get along with his bosses? Did he leave for better paying jobs? Well, we don't know why he quit the jobs. There are people with rough job histories, but that's not a diagnostic sign of autism.
That doesn't raise your eyebrows?
Well, that's a lot of jobs, but there are many alternative explanations other than autism. I'll just reiterate, the history here is not suggestive of autism spectrum disorder.
Dr. Danziger, what do you know about these homicides in this case?
Well, I know there were 3 women in Volusia County, Miss Green, Miss Patton, and Miss Gunther, and these happened on December 20, 2005, January 4, 2006, February 24, 2006. There was also the death of Rachel Bay in Palm Beach County, March 7, 2016. What was in common was the women were generally found naked, evidence that there was recent sexual activity, shot in the back of the head, although I think the one in Palm Beach might have been strangled. And this was essentially a cold case until DNA evidence was found suggesting that Mr. Hayes was the perpetrator, and then law enforcement was able to obtain his DNA from a cigarette and bottle, and that's how they identified him as the suspect. That's my understanding of the case. And that the women were, not to disparage them, apparently prostitutes.
Yes, sir. And it's fair to say then that the fact that it's a cold case and the defendant, Mr. Hayes, could not be examined or tested by a psychologist makes it, because it's so many years have passed, really makes it difficult for a doctor like yourself to rule out an autism spectrum disorder. Is that a fair statement?
Your question doesn't make sense because you're suggesting the murders somehow relate to autism. And we don't diagnose autism by saying somebody committed murder. So your question doesn't make sense to me. I'm sorry.
Well, doesn't the fact that this defendant was just found guilty of 3 homicides suggest there was something wrong with him?
Well, yes. If somebody who commits 3 homicides, there's something wrong with him. People shouldn't go around killing women. But that doesn't mean they have autism.
Now, did you mentioned, but I don't know if you really fully read them, you mentioned that you read Dr. Graham's report. Did you read both Dr. Graham's report and Dr. Eisenstein's report?
Yes.
Okay. And you noted that they had some conclusions, some findings of impairment?
Yes.
And you don't disagree with those, do you?
No, I'm not going to disagree with the results of neuropsychological testing. I'm not a neuropsychologist. But what I note is that neither of them diagnosed a neurocognitive disorder. I note that Dr. Graham did not say that this meets criteria for neurocognitive disorder. Neither of them found evidence for depression, mania, psychosis, other psychiatric diagnoses. And while they noted some findings, is there evidence to show that there was extreme mental and emotional disturbance in 2005 and 6, or that his capacity was substantially impaired to conform his conduct or appreciate the wrongfulness? The data just isn't there, and I didn't see anything in the reports of those 2 doctors, with all respect to them, to suggest what was going on at the time back then.
Okay. But you are aware, aren't you, that Dr. Eisenstein directed that this is a good case in which a neurocognitive imaging expert should be consulted?
Well, that was Dr. Eisenstein's opinion, and indeed a expert was obtained, Dr. Wu, of course.
And you yourself are not a neurocognitive imaging expert, are you?
Of course, I'm a psychiatrist in Orlando.
Okay, now you're aware that the victims were found naked, right?
Yes,
Face down,
yes.
in remote areas away from people.
I don't know if they were in remote areas. Wasn't one found on Beach Street between buildings, I think? I don't think they were in remote areas. And I think in Palm Beach, one was dumped by the side of the road, apparently moved.
Judge, can we just objecting a sidebar just for 1 moment?
Yes. sorry?
We need to approach a third time.
Okay.
I have no further questions. This is what you're showing.
All right, thank you. Any cross? Redirect.
No, Your Honor.
Thank you. You may step down. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Honor.
All right, I'd like to have the jurors step into this room right here. Bill, do not take them to the back room.
Okay.
Just right here. Oh, yeah.
I am not going to mute, though. You want me to mute?
Good.
You want me to mute?
No mute. Okay, state you have any other witnesses?
No, Your Honor.
Okay, thank you. Defense, you wanted to make a motion earlier and I cut you guys off.
Yes, sir, Your Honor.
Go ahead and turn the camera on, Bill.
Your Honor, the defense moves to recall and for sure rebuttal Dr. Wu. The reasons are that Dr. Nagin testified that there's no support for the use of PTI on patients and that, DTI, and that's simply not true. He said there's no indicated that there's no literature or scientific basis for the use of DTI in patients, and Dr. Wu, I would call him, testified that there are indeed publications and there's indeed support for using DTI in patients. And also, Dr. Nagin testified that there's no support, there's no link between amygdala enlargement and autism, and that's simply not true. Dr. Wu has some literature and some professional publications that establish that there's indeed a link between the two. And I really need to recall him and have him testify and clarify that. Otherwise, these jurors are going to be left with a false impression that these things are unsupported, when in fact they are.
Well, they might be supported. If I recall the testimony correctly, the two leading entities that control neuropsychology, I think, have come against the use of these type of testing on individuals for the diagnosis that you're trying to propose to the jury. I mean, and all we got is this abstracts and studies that Dr. Wu wants to use. Okay, what's this state?
State objects, Judge. I think first the defense is mischaracterizing. They don't understand exactly. Dr. Negan testified that it's being utilized in teaching hospitals for certain nerve surgeries, that they're using it for that purpose. For diagnosing TBIs, they said it's not acceptable, and he did cite to those two authorities that regulate radiology, which is the folks who use these tests on a daily basis, Judge. I don't think it's Dr. Wu's already testified that he uses it and it's something that he uses. To come up and say that he's read a report that it's okay here or there. He's already admitted on cross that those two bodies that govern it, really, that he doesn't agree with them. I brought it out with him. You understand that they don't think it's appropriate for individualized individuals. And he said, yes, but I don't agree with that. So it's already come out, Judge. And as to, I'm going to be honest with the court. I don't remember what Dr. Negan said about autistic and whatever part of the brain. I don't know. And I really can't respond to that, Judge. I don't.
Well,
Judge, I would just add that Dr. Negan is a general car crash and neuroradiologist. He's not a neuroimaging expert at all, and he's given this testimony about neurocognitive imaging, something that is not at all his forte, and it's very misleading to lead it at that.
I'm just curious, if you knew of these things, why didn't you cross-examine him on them at the time that he was testifying? If you knew that there was studies out there that support Dr. Wu's opinion. I mean, I've already let this thing get way far off track.
Your Honor, I didn't quite know everything he was saying. I myself am a lawyer, not a neurocognitive expert, and I did indicate to the court there's a possibility I might have to call Dr. Wu and I might ask the court for some rebuttal. I didn't know it. I thought it was a possibility, and here we are.
The sir rebuttal is completely within the discretion of the court. No.
Could I speak with Mr. Anderson?
Oh, go ahead. Speak to Mr. Anderson, but I can't let you argue. I don't even know his name.
It's Tony something. I'm trying to think.
Your Honor, first of all,
You know what? I don't want to waste any more time. Go ahead.
this is actually rebuttal to rebuttal, Your Honor.
Let's put him on. Go ahead. I think the state is adequately prepared to cross-examine him. I'm going to narrow it down to a very small area. I'm not going to let you go any place, all over the place, and I'm not going to wait for an objection. I'm going to interrupt if I think he's repeating anything or he's going into something new. Okay? All right. Get him up in the stand. Get the jury in.
Ladies and gentlemen. Well done.
Oh. It's all right. Go ahead.
You can go. All right, you good.
Thanks. Hey, Bill.
May I proceed?
One moment. Dr. Wu is being called for rebuttal.
Dr. Wu, you're aware that Dr. Nagin, the state's radiology expert, testified that there's no support for the use of DTI on patients. Your response to that?
I'm going to object, Judge, that's an improper statement, that's not what he testified.
Sustained.
Okay. Dr. Wu, is the use of DTI on patients supported?
Judge, I'm going to object, that's an improper question.
Overruled.
The use of DTI in individual patients is supported by peer-reviewed literature. There are articles that say that it is kosher or fine to use DTI on an individual case-by-case basis. There are textbooks that say that it is fine to use DTI on a case-by-case basis. For example, Osborne's Diagnostic Imaging textbook. There are societies, such as the American Functional Society of Neuroradiology, that says it is okay to use DTI on an individual clinical basis. And so Dr. Nagin is incorrect, in my opinion, and I think there is ample support for using DTI on an individual case-by-case basis. It's not purely experimental, and there are many other hospitals, such as Walter Reed Hospital, which is using MRI DTI to assess traumatic brain injury in returning veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan, not on an experimental basis, but on a clinical basis.
And next topic, Dr. Nagin talked about amygdala enlargement, no support for that being connected to autism. Comments?
That is incorrect. There is an article by Gibbard published in 2017 which clearly states that it's a review as well as an independent replication which shows that there is clear evidence that amygdala volume enlargement is significant in autistic spectrum. And Dr. Nagin showed that there was amygdala enlargement in the blue bars of the neuroquant, where he sort of poo-pooed and said, oh, well, larger is fine. Larger is not fine if it means that you have autistic spectrum disorder.
That's all I have.
Thank you. Any cross?
So we're clear, Doc. You're saying the American College of Radiology, when they say that you should not use DTI for traumatic brain injuries on an individual basis, that they're wrong?
Yes, in my opinion, they're wrong.
That yes or no? Yes.
Yes.
You think they're wrong? Okay. And you're not a part of the American College of Radiology, are you?
I'm not.
Right. And it covers the people who actually read it for people dying in hospitals for medical care every day, right?
They're talking about its use on a clinical basis.
That's not my question. My question, sir, to you was, this is the organization or group of people that help save people's lives every day, help treat people with diseases, and they don't think you should use it, but you disagree with their opinion?
Yes.
Okay. Same question for the Radiological Society of North America. Big group of people who deal with saving lives every day, looking at traumatic brain injuries, determining if people need emergency surgeries, and they don't recommend it at all. But you disagree with them too?
Well, it's not just me. As I say, there are textbooks, there's a society.
Sir,
and
the question for you is, you disagree with them.
I disagree with them, but...
Thank you. That's it. No other questions.
Thank you.
Nothing further.
Thank you. You may step down. All right. I think, State, will you rest?
Yes, sir.
I should have asked you that, okay. Ladies and gentlemen, both the state and the defense have rested. The only thing that remains is closing arguments and then your deliberations. I'm going to release you for the day, let you go home tonight. The same drill that we followed last week, bring a bag just in case it's necessary with whatever you need for an overnight, if such thing is necessary. Not that I'm suggesting that it should be, but you should be prepared for whatever reasons. Once you get sequestered during deliberations, you will not be allowed to leave. I want to remind you, please don't do any investigation. I noticed one witness says, well, you can Google X. Don't Google anything. While you're away from the courtroom, don't talk to anybody, to your friends or neighbors or whoever, your boss. Don't say anything about this case. Don't let anybody say anything to you about the case. And certainly don't do any research on your own about the case. What you have learned from within the courtroom is the tools that you need to use in order to deliberate in your case, okay? So I'm going to release you until tomorrow. Parking tomorrow, again, will be the same thing. It's just like we did last week. The deputies will have a designated area for you to park all your vehicles together. And then we'll see you tomorrow, okay? Yeah, we have a question. 10 o'clock, 10 o'clock. I want you to come at 10 o'clock.
So I just want to clarify that tomorrow we will be starting deliberations.
After closing argument.
A bag tomorrow.
Correct, and then leave it in your car. You don't have to bring it up here, okay? And Bill, you'll have menus for them first thing in the morning?
Yep. Okay, let me view this.
Okay. See you tomorrow. 10 o'clock. 10 o'clock tomorrow. 10 o'clock. Counsel, I'm going to need you here tomorrow at 8:30 so we can go over the jury instructions one more time.
Your Honor, has my poster ever been found? Is that gone?
Say it again.
My poster was lost for a while. I was wondering if it turned up at all.
Your poster has disappeared.
Okay.
So,
If you want to make it on a slide, I will have the TV here tomorrow, so you can plug it in.
here, these are the proposed jury instructions. There's changes that have to be made. You give the defendant a set. So I need to know from the defense tomorrow whether or not you want to have a list of the mitigators listed inside the jury instructions, or you just want me to leave it open-ended so that you can argue any mitigator that you brought up during the course of the trial and argue those things to the jury. And I'll have just a general instruction saying that anything can be a mitigator. So you need to start thinking about that.
Probably a list, Your Honor. I will think about it.
I wrote down the list of mitigators that you brought up during the course of the trial and put them inside the instruction, but I'll leave it up to you.
Yes, sir.
Oh. And then these are for the lawyers here. If you don't mind, I go.
I'm sorry.
These are for the lawyers. All right, so is there anything else we need to address before we adjourn?
No, sir, thank you.
All right, we'll see you tomorrow morning at 8:30. 8:30 for the attorney. Okay?
Is there a verdict form you already have, Judge?
I do not have a verdict form prepared yet.
It will just be basically going mostly by the standard verdict form online?
Yes.
I figured, okay, so
Okay.
thank you.
All right, thank you all. Good night.
Thank you, Judge.
Alyssa, can you go over there and unmute that? Unmute it and turn the camera on.
It's right next to it.
Bottom left. Bottom left. Yeah, okay, we will be adjourned until tomorrow morning at 8:30. The jury will be arriving at 10 o'clock. Thank you.